Before starting the actual Sicha, we're just going to start off with quoting a little bit of the Toras Koyanim on a pasuk in the Parsha, which the Rashi and the Sicha are going to be about. The pasuk is speaking about a Zov, a person that has a particular type of discharge as a result of which he becomes Tamei and the things he comes in contact with become Tamei. This is considered one of the strictest or strongest tumois. And the pasuk says that any earthenware vessel that he comes in contact with needs to be broken, and any wooden vessel needs to be toiveled. A general rule, usually regarding earthenware vessels, in most tumois, the earthenware vessel become tamei only if the tumah goes into the ear space of the earthenware vessel, not just by touching, coming in contact, physical contact with the earthenware vessel. So says the Toras Koyanim on these words, Asher Yiga Boy Hazov. You might think that if Yiga Boy means touching it, you might think it means even if the Zav touches it from the outside, it will become Tamei. Says the Toras Koyanim, wait a second. If even a mace, if even a dead body that comes in contact with the outside of an earthenware vessel, it does not become Tamei. Again, the tumah of a klicheres of an earthenware vessel is only from the ear space inside. So the Zav, which is a lighter tumah than tumas mace, surely should not make an earthenware vessel tamei just from the outside. The Toras Koyanim goes on and argues, perhaps the Zav is actually a stricter tumah than tumas mace, because a Zav could make something tamei in the tumah what's called mishkav u'moishav. Mishkav u'moishav means if he's lying down on something or sitting on something, even if there isn't direct contact, it becomes tamei. This type of tumah does not apply by a dead body, where it actually has to come directly in contact with it. So maybe a zav is actually stricter than tumas meis. So maybe over here, asher yiga boy hazav maybe does mean that even if he touches the earthenware vessel, it becomes tamei. For this, the Toras Koyanim says we have a gzeira shavu. The pasuk says asher yiga boy hazav. We're focusing on the word boy. That the zav touches it. We have another pasuk. This is a pasuk in regards to karbonis, a pasuk in Parshas Tzav, where it speaks about a carbon being cooked in a vessel, asher tevushal boy. Just like over there, the boy is referring to the ear space of the pot, so too over here, it refers to the ear space of the klicheres. That's the way the tumah by a zav also works. But if that's the case, so what does it mean, asher yiga boy? It does speak about a certain type of contact. So the Toras Koyanim concludes by saying we're referring to a type of contact that's as if he touched the whole thing, which means it's not just merely touching it, but actually moving it. If he moved it, then there's the special tumah that's specifically only by a zav that makes something tamei by moving it, again, even without direct contact, just by moving it, even if you moved it through something else, etc. Now we go to the Sicha. So on this pasuk, klicheres asher yiga boy hazav yishaver, an earthenware vessel that the zav comes in contact with needs to be broken, l'chol kli eitz, and any wooden vessel needs to be toiveled in water. Rashi quotes the words of klicheres asher yiga boy hazav and explains, using the same words from the Toras Koyanim. Yachol, you might think, even if he touches it from the outside. Rashi then says v'chulu, etc., as it says in Toras Koyanim. Ad, Rashi tells us to look in the Toras Koyanim all the way until the words Ezeu magoy shehu kakuloi. What kind of contact is it as if you touched the whole thing? That is if you moved it. So we need to understand what was difficult in Pshutei Shel Mikra, for which Rashi needs to explain the words yigaboy according to the Chazal in Toras Koyanim, that it means moving it, rather than saying yigaboy means simply touching it. And that would be touching it, any type of touching it, even from the outside. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is that we cannot say touching it means literally touching it, because we already learned earlier in Parsha Shmini by the tumah of a sheretz, of one of those creepy crawly animals that are tamei. Rashi over there taught us already that a klicheres, that an earthenware vessel does not become tamei unless there's something in the ear space of the klicheres, of the earthenware vessel. And therefore, when it says over here, klicheres asher yigaboy, that the zav touches the klicheres, we can't say that it means just touching it from the outside. Now, you might want to distinguish and say that tumas sheretz is considered a much lighter, more lenient tumah than a tumas zav. So perhaps over there, a earthenware vessel wouldn't become tamei unless something went into the ear space, not just by touching it. Whereas Tuma Zov, which is much stricter, as we said before, it's Metami Mishkov Moshev, even the things that he lies on down and sits on, even without direct contact. So you might say, since over here a Zov is a much stricter Tuma, so perhaps the earthenware vessel would become Tame, even if the Zov just touches it from the outside, and therefore Yiga by over here means simply touching it. So in order for us not to say that, not to make this distinction and think that a Zav, because it's stricter, even if he touches it, it will become Tameh, especially you might say that goes simpler according to Pshutei Shel Mikra. This is why Rashi actually in his Dibur HaMaschil quotes not only the words that he's explaining Yigaboy to say that it doesn't mean touching, rather moving, but he also quotes those words that will actually highlight this distinction. Meaning to say, Rashi quotes in this Dibur HaMaschil Ukli Cheres Asher Yigaboy Hazov. In other words, yes, we're speaking about an earthenware vessel, and yes, we're speaking about a Zav, which seemingly is a stricter tumah. And therefore you might think, Afilu Noga Boy Me'achoyra, because we're speaking about such a strict tumah, so you might think that even if he touches it from the outside, and again Rashi says V'chulu, etc., as we learned already in the Toras Kohanim, which the Toras Kohanim says, the Rebbe now quotes the Toras Kohanim, which we mentioned before, V'dinu, that it's logical, umay meis hachamor, that if the mace, the dead body, which is much stricter, does not make a klicheres tameh from the outside by touching it from the outside, so then the zav, which is considered more lenient, surely shouldn't be able to make a klicheres, an earthenware vessel, tameh from touching it from the outside. Then the Toras Kohanim goes on and says that, wait a second, the mace is in some senses not, in some way, it's not as strict as the Zov, because it does not cause that tumah called Mishkav U'Moishav. And then the Toras Kohanim goes on and explains that Gzeir Shava that we mentioned, Talmud Loimar Asher Yiga Boy, because over here it says the word boy, and by the carbon that was cooked in a pot, it also said the words Asher Tavush al Boy. So we learn out from there that boy means that the tumah is actually coming from within the ear space of the earthenware vessel. You're then going to say, so what does it mean, yiga boy, if touching it just from the outside doesn't do anything? So what does yiga boy mean? What kind of contact are we talking about? We're definitely speaking about some sort of contact. And this is why Rashi brings the ending of the Toras Kohanim, Ezel Magoy, what is considered a contact that is as if you touch the whole thing? That is when you move it. Says the Rebbe, but we need to understand. What Rashi is doing over here seems to be a bit strange. He's quoting a tiny drop from the Toras Kohanim and not quoting most of it. Either Rashi should have quoted the whole Toras Kohanim, including the way it's proven that Yiga Boy, touching it, cannot mean from the outside. And if Rashi is relying that we're going to look in the Toras Kohanim ourselves, then he also shouldn't have quoted the end of the Toras Kohanim, Ezel Magoy, what's considered touching it, that's considered as if he touched the whole thing. It's if you move it. All Rashi should have done was he just should have finished off with those words, Kedeisa b'Toras Kohanim. This Rashi does this some other times. We find, for example, in Parshas Vayikra, where Rashi speaks about a pasuk and he says, you might think this is an unnecessary pasuk. Well, it's darshaned already in Toras Kohanim. So again, the Rebbe's question is, Rashi started off at Toras Kohanim. He says, Yochel, you might think that it's even if he touches it from the outside. Then Rashi just says, Chulu, etc., doesn't give us any of the proof that it doesn't mean that. And then he says, so what does it mean? If you move it. So why is Rashi quoting some of it and not quoting some of it? Now, simply you might say that the reason why Rashi does quote the very end, that what's considered touching it is if you move it, is because Rashi is trying to translate the words of the pasuk, Yigaboy. Now, what does it mean coming in contact with it? It means moving it. Whereas the other part of the Toras Kohanim, which is just trying to prove that a klicheres cannot, an earthenware vessel cannot become tamei just by touching the outside, maybe that's not so relevant, and therefore Rashi is relying that you're going to look for that if you're interested in the Toras Kohanim. However, the Rebbe says it's difficult to say this, because as discussed many times, anything that is necessary to understand Pshutei Shel Mikra, Rashi will bring it out in a very clear way for a Ben Chamish L'Mikra. And therefore, if the translations of the word Yigaboy could mean that you could touch it from the outside, if that's the translation of the words, Rashi should have explained to us very clearly why we are not explaining it that way. All Rashi tells us is go look in the Teiras Koyanim, and then he says, oh, so what does Yigaboy mean? Moving it. But what's the proof that it does not mean actually touching it? Rashi shouldn't be relying on just referencing the Teiras Koyanim, especially that this is something that's not even that you would understand by yourself. The Teiras Koyanim is learning it out from a Gzei Reshava, learning out from boy that says over here, with boy that says elsewhere. So we somehow must say that according Pshutei Shel Mikra, the proof is not from the Gzei Reshava of boy and boy, which is clearly not brought in Rashi, but somehow it's from the words that Rashi himself quotes from the Teiras Koyanim. Now, again, Rashi does not bring the whole Teiras Koyanim. So the part where he says v'chulu k'de'isa b'Teiras Koyanim, etc., as it says in Teiras Koyanim, that's only for additional explanation or proof. If you want more, then you'll be able to see more in the Teiras Koyanim. But the main point that you need to understand could be understood even from the part that Rashi does bring. And that's why it's enough for Rashi to say v'chulu k'de'isa b'Teiras Koyanim. So how do we understand this? In other words, we're holding over here at the point, where could we actually learn this idea from without that Gzei Reshava and the Teiras Koyanim, without looking at this Teiras Koyanim? How can we understand this idea that Yigaboy does not mean just simply touching it? So we might suggest that we could learn it from the Tumas Meis. We know again that Tumas Meis is something very, very strict, and yet it does not make a klicheres tomei from the outside, as will be learned later in Parshas Chukas. From this we can understand that also a zav, which is not as strict as the mace, would not make a klicheres tomei from the outside. Perhaps this is what Rashi is referencing the Teiras Koyanim. Not that he wants us to look in the Teiras Koyanim to understand that Gzei Reshava of boy from boy. Rather, we're speaking about that Kal V'chomer that the Teiras Koyanim said, that if the mace, which is more strict, does not make a klicheres, an earthenware vessel, tummy from the outside, then the zav, which is a smaller, a lesser tumah, surely should not make a klicheres, tummy from the outside. Now this Kal V'chomer, we don't actually have to look in the Teiras Koyanim for even. That's what he's referencing the Teiras Koyanim for, but Kal V'chomer is a logical svara that we can understand even in Pshutei Shel Mikra. Now, even though you might say, well, wait a second, the Teiras Koyanim actually knocks off that Kal V'chomer. The Teiras Koyanim actually ended up saying that the Zav in some way is more strict than the Tumas Meis, because he makes a Tumah called Mishkov Moshav, which Meis does not. Says the Rebbe, all that would do is make that the Meis, Tumas Meis and Zav should sort of now be on equal parts. In other words, the Teiras Koyanim started saying that Tumas Meis is definitely stricter. So fine, by saying that Zav has its own strictness, so now they're equals. But not necessarily saying that Zav is definitely stronger than Tumas Meis. And therefore, according to Pshutei Shel Mikra, we would still be able to say, okay, they're similar to each other. So if Tumas Meis does not make an earthenware vessel tummy from the outside, that's enough of a reason that the same thing should apply by the Tumah of a Zav, that it also should not make a earthenware vessel tummy from the outside. Now, so you might say, so if the whole proof is just from a mace, from the fact that the dead body is not making an earthenware vessel tummy from the outside, why do we even need to bother going to the Teiras Koyanim? That's just simply what it says in Chumash. We could just understand it from the Pasuk. So the reason why Rashi is referencing to the Teiras Koyanim and not the Pasuk, which would be Pshutei Shel Mikra and Parshas Chukas, is because the proof in the pasuk would be connected with a whole long arichas to be able to understand what the psukim are saying, and even there, not necessarily that Ben Chamish Shel Mikra will work out exactly how we're understanding this limud, learning it out from the mace. Whereas in the Teiras Koyanim it says it very specifically and very clearly. So this is why Rashi references the Teiras Koyanim, but really technically it's understood even from Pshutei Shel Mikra. So again, before continuing the Sicha, the Rebbe says perhaps this is the proof why Yigabai over here cannot mean touching it from the outside, because Tumas Meis also, even without a Kal V'chomer, just a similarity, Tumas Meis also does not work from the outside. Says the Rebbe, but we cannot say that this is the proof that Rashi is using. Why is that? Because in addition to the fact that it's still not going to be smooth, why doesn't Rashi write it clearly that that's the proof, the point of Tumas Meis? But in addition to that, let's look at Tumas Meis again in comparison with the Tumah of a Zov. We want to say over here that the Zov is going to be making things Tomei even by moving them. Now, by Tumas Meis, that doesn't happen. A Tomei Meis does not make things Tomei just by moving it. Again, it has to be direct contact, not just because he caused it to be moved. If we're to say that the Pasuk by Os Asher Yigaboy is coming to tell us a Chidush, that the Zov is going to make things Tomei by moving it, which is as Rashi explains it, and this is clearly not by Tumas Meis, that means clearly our Pasuk is coming to tell us that there is something more about the Tumah of a Zov, more than Tumas Meis. Then by the same token, why can't we say that Asher Yigaboy is also something more than Tumas Meis? In other words, that the way a Zov makes things Tomei is by touching it from the outside, even though a Meis does not make things Tomei from the outside. Again, just to summarize, if we anyways have to say that our Pasuk is coming to tell us a Chidush in the words Asher Yigaboy, that it's going to be more and different to Tumas Meis, so why say that it means Tumas Hesed, the Tumah of moving something? We could just say that it actually means even if you touch it, if the Zav touches it from the outside, it becomes Tamei. In fact, there'll be an advantage to this Pirush because now we could translate Yigaboy in the simple Pshutish or Mikra translation that it means touching it. So we're still stuck in our Sicha so far. So where do we know that Asher Yigaboy does not mean simply touching it? Again, this learning from the Tumas Meis didn't work. So we might say that what was forcing Rashi to say this, that Yigaboy does not mean touching it, is actually from the end of the Pasuk. The Pasuk says, as we said before, V'chol kli eitz yishatev b'mayim, that a wooden vessel needs to be toiveled in the mikveh. So now, if we should say Asher Yigaboy means moving it, which is what Rashi says, then we'll understand why the Pasuk needs to say, and a wooden vessel also needs to be toiveled. What's the chiddush of this part of the Pasuk? That a Zav, by moving, whether it's an earthenware vessel or a wooden vessel, the wooden vessel will also become Tomei by moving it. So we understand why the wooden vessel needs to be mentioned. There's a new chiddush in Tumah of a Zav, that even if you just move it, it becomes Tomei. But if Yigaboy means simply just touching it from the outside, then what's the point of saying that the Zav is making a wooden Keli Tomei by touching it? A wooden Keli obviously becomes Tomei by touching it. This is by all sorts of Tumois. So in other words, this might be the reason that's forcing us to say that Yigaboy means moving it rather than touching it. Because again, if it only means touching it, then why bother even speaking about a wooden Keli? Of course it becomes Tomei if you touch it. If we say Asher Yigaboy in our Pasuk means moving it, maybe now we can understand the meaning of the words, why it has to add the words wooden Keli, because it's telling us that a wooden Keli will become Tomei by moving it. But the Rebbe says this explanation is also difficult to say that that's what Rashi means, because if that would be the case, Rashi in his Dibur HaMaschil should have been either saying the words V'chol Klietz, or at least hinting to them with a V'goymer, because that would be the proof for his explanation. And since Rashi does not do this, this is obvious then that that's not the proof that Yigaboy means moving it rather than touching it. Or that the proof that Rashi does have would at least be a better proof than this proof of Klietz. In order to understand this, says the Rebbe, we're first going to look at something in the previous pasuk. It would seem to be that the previous pasuk that says V'chol asher yigaboy azov, the pasuk says anything that the zav touches, v'yadav leishatev b'mayim, and he didn't rinse his hands in water, which Rashi actually explains means he didn't toivel. V'chibes begadov, needs to wash his clothes. V'rochaz b'mayim, needs to toivel. V'tomei ad ha'arav, and is tomei till at night. So any person that the zav touches, or anything that the zav touches, becomes tomei. This pasuk seems to be a completely extra pasuk. The pasuk had already said earlier, a few psukim earlier, it said already, v'anugeya b'vsar hazav, someone that touches the zav needs to wash his clothes, needs to toivel in water, and he's tomei till at night. What's the point of this pasuk then? Now, even though there is a certain halacha that we learn out of this pasuk, which is, as Rashi says, that what the pasuk is teaching us is that as long as the zav did not toivel from his tumah, that means even if he finished seeing the discharge and he counted his 7 days, but as long as he didn't become toivel in the mikvah, he still makes things tamei. So the Rebbe says seemingly that's not a good enough reason why we need our pasuk. First of all, we could have learned out that halacha with a kal v'chomer from a yoldus, a woman that has given birth. she has to toivel. Furthermore, even after she toivels, b'chol kodesh leisiga, she's still not allowed to touch holy things from karbonos. And she has to wait until 40 days after becoming tar, the following days. The following day she has to bring a kapara and so on, and only then could she start eating karbonos. And furthermore, the Rebbe says, for this the Torah would not have to repeat a whole pasuk. It could have just said those words, v'yodav leishatav b'moyim, which is from where we learned this halacha in the previous pasuk, v'negeya b'vsar hazov. It could have just said over there, v'yodav leishatav b'moyim. Why do we need this whole extra pasuk? And it is because of this seemingly extra pasuk, because of this question, that the Gemara, in fact, will learn the idea of hesed, that a zov, when he moves something, it becomes tummy, is actually from that pasuk, because it seems to be a completely extra pasuk. But Rashi, where does Rashi learn out this idea of tumas hesed, that just by moving it becomes tummy, is only from our pasuk that we've been discussing in this later pasuk. So the question is, according to Rashi, what was the point of that pasuk that said that anything the zav touches is tummy, and we don't see Rashi dealing with it? The explanation to that is that even in Pshutei Shel Mikra, we know that a whole pasuk could be said even for one little tiny detail that's neschadish in this pasuk. That comes a new concept in this pasuk. We know, with the Kal V'chomer, that sometimes the Torah will repeat a whole section because of one new thing in it. We see this right away in Parshas Bereshis, that the Torah repeats the whole story of Adam and Chava being created because of certain new details that are added in the story, and other examples. And therefore, says the Rebbe, in Pshutei Shel Mikra, it's not really a question why that pasuk needs to say V'chol asher yiga bo yazav, because, as we said, there is a chidush in that pasuk where it says V'yodav leishatav b'moyim, and the chidush in those words V'yodav leishatav b'moyim, Rashi tells us we learn out a halacha from those words. Rashi says, after explaining the simple pshat, which we said before means that he toivels, Rashi says that these words teach us that the inside parts of the body, or of those organs that have certain insides to them, don't need to come in contact with the water, like the inside of the mouth, etc. Rather, only the exposed, revealed parts of the body, like the hands. And therefore, we don't have a problem in that pasuk. Why does it have to say anything that the zav touches becomes tamei? Because it's mainly coming to tell us this halacha v'yodav leishatav b'moyim, that the way you toivel is that the outer parts of your body have to come in contact with water. Then comes the next pasuk, and now the question becomes again, so what's the chiddush in this pasuk? What's the pasuk coming to say? That a keli becomes tamei? That we can know again with a kal v'chomer from previous dinim. If a person becomes tamei by the zav touching him, then surely the vessels become tamei. Again, we said a zav in many ways is stricter than the other tumos because it has a tumah of mishkav and moishav. And therefore, when the pasuk says "V'chol asher yiga bo yazav," we might then think, maybe the chiddush in this pasuk is maybe you actually even touching it from the outside is going to make it tummy. And this is why Rashi has to say, you might think even by touching it from the outside, since the simple pirush of yiga boy means from the outside, so you might say that's what our pasuk is coming to teach us. The pasuk is coming to teach us because we just asked, what's the point of this pasuk? The pasuk is coming to teach us that even by touching it from the outside, this earthenware vessel will become tummy. Now, before we said there's a problem with saying that that's the point, would be the point of the pasuk, because then why would it say v'chol kliyates? Why would it have to even mention the wooden vessels? Because that would be obvious that if you touch it, it becomes tummy. So the Rebbe says that's not a question, because we said already before that even if there's one new thing in the pasuk, that's enough. And therefore, that would be the new thing in our pasuk, that a klei cheres becomes tamei by touching it from the outside. And then the pasuk also adds about the wooden vessel. And to sort of highlight this svara, to highlight this hava, that perhaps that's what it means in the pasuk yigaboy, that maybe even touching it from the outside makes tamei. That's where Rashi is sending us off to the Toras Kohanim, where we actually see that because of the stringency of the tumah of the zav, there is room to think that it should make the earthenware vessel from the outside, even though by a mace, it would not make a tummy from the outside. In other words, when Rashi is sending us off to the Toras Kohanim, It's not actually coming to point us to the area of the Toras Kohanim that's going to prove that the tumah is not coming from the outside. In other words, you can't say that Asher Yigaboy means touching it from the outside. It's actually coming to the point to point to the idea of the Toras Kohanim of saying, yes, there is a svara. Yachol, I might think that it actually means from the outside. Maybe that's the way it becomes Tomei. Rashi says, V'chulu k'de'isa b'Toras Kohanim. It doesn't bring the whole thing, because again, this is only coming to highlight the svara of perhaps we might think that that's what it means, that it's coming to touch it from the outside. So how do we actually know that it doesn't mean touching it from the outside? This is the part that Rashi does bring from the Toras Kohanim, where he says, Ezel magoy shehu kekuloi, what is considered a kind of touch, which is considered as if you touch the whole thing? That's when you move it, as we'll discuss now. How do we understand this? So the Rebbe says, when we look at this pasuk, in addition to the fact that the whole beginning of the whole pasuk seemed to be extra, as we said before, the words Asher Yiga Bo Yazov seem to be completely redundant, because this pasuk is coming in continuation to the previous pasuk that we mentioned before. V'choil Asher Yiga Bo Yazov, anything that the zav touches. So why does it have to say again the words and an earthenware vessel that the zav touches? It would have been enough to say an earthenware vessel needs to be broken. Even in our pasuk itself, let's see the next few words. It says, and a wooden vessel needs to be toivel in the water. So why does it have to say again, Asher Yiga Boy Hazov? Called Klicheres Asher Yiga Boy Hazov. By the Kliyetza doesn't say again Asher Yiga Boy Hazov. And therefore it makes sense to say that the Chidush in our pasuk is in those words, Asher Yiga Boy. What does Yiga Boy mean? It's a new type of negiah, a new type of touch. Not like the regular types of touching that we ever discussed earlier. Yiga, the type of Yiga is boy in the whole thing, in the whole keli. In other words, it's not just that regular type of touching, we only coming in contact with a little part of the vessel. To use the words of the Toras Kohanim that Rashi brings, Ezel magoy shel kekuli, what kind of touch is as if you touch the whole thing? That is when you move it. The whole keli is then moving. Whereas, if you learn that the chiddush of our pasuk is that it's touching the klicheres from the outside, then the main chiddush would only be in the words of klicheres, or also the word boy, but not in the word yiga boy. And that was what we're trying to explain, that the words yiga is actually telling us that there's something new being told to us in our pasuk, that there's a new type of touch. Perhaps again, just to summarize some of the main points that we discussed, is that Rashi's main proof for the fact that in this case, Yigaboy means moving it rather than touching it, is actually because of these extra words in our pasuk. The whole pasuk seemed to be like an extra pasuk. What's this pasuk even saying? Because seemingly we would have known that everything becomes tamei, kelim become tamei. And here the pasuk is coming and say, Ukli cheres asher Yigaboy, that the zav touched the klicheres. So we're therefore saying, especially the words Asher Yigaboy completely seem to be extra because the previous pasuk used those words already. We could have just been a continuation. What should happen to the klicheres? And therefore Rashi is telling us that the word Asher Yigaboy, as the words for which he brings from the Toras Kohanim, Yigaboy means a whole different type of touch, where he's actually coming in contact with the whole thing by moving it. The Rebbe now moves on, Torah and Avodas Hashem. A klicheres is made of earth. And this is a hint to the person. Adam Yisoidei Meyafor, a person comes from earth, as the pasuk says, Vayitzer Hashem Elikim es Adam Afar min Adama. Hashem created man, earth from the ground, dust from the ground. The pasuk also says, Hashem says to Adam Arishin Ki Afarata, you are dust. And this is what we say, that a klicheres does not become tamei from the outside. What does this mean? That those in Yonim, those matters of Olam Hazeh, they get stuck onto the body of the person. Generally, the body of the person, compared to the essence of the person, would be considered a choydav, like the back, like the outside. This can never contaminate the inside, the essence of the Yid. That is, since Hashem created a person, a Yid, in such a way that he needs to have food and drink and all other inyanim of Olam Hazeh, and according to nature, yes, he will have some pleasure from them, and the avodah is not to break the body. Famously, as the Baal Shem Tov teaches, it has to be ozev tazivima. You need to work along with the body to make his body, to make the portion of the world a place for Hashem down here. So the person is not at fault that he now has some of these inyanim of Olam Hazeh that sort of stuck onto his body, that got connected to him. these pleasures and these things that he had from Olam Hazeh. Even though, of course, eventually he has to become purified from those things as well. So again, the Kli Cheres, the earthenware vessel, does not become Tomei. The Yid does not become Tomei from these things that are sort of sticking on to him from the outside. But Medvar Mamurim says that, but when does this apply? If he actually stays the way Hashem created him, Hashem made him into that earthenware vessel, that Kli Cheres. Earth represents the idea that he has a certain element of bittul. If on the other hand, he's like a Kliyetz, a wooden vessel, like wood that grows, he also holds himself high and great, etc. Or if he's a metal keli, metal being hard, strong again with a certain element of yeshus and so on, so he's no longer staying in the way Hashem created him, then there is some room for becoming tomei, even me'achoyrav, even so to speak, from these outside things. And this is what Rashi comes along now and speaks again, going back to the earthenware vessel. You might think that an earthenware vessel could become tomei from the outside. What does that mean? We said that by a zav, perhaps we would entertain this thought that it could become tomei even from the outside. What does that mean in avodas Hashem? That we might think that if it's such a strict tumah like a zav, this could make a yid tomei even from the outside. What does this mean? The concept of ziva, this type of discharge, is not like the natural type of discharge which happens, for example, by the blood of a nidah, but rather ziva is more considered like a sickness of the guf. In other words, that there's more blood or more discharges, more than the regular nature of the world. In avodas Adam, what this would mean is, dam nida would represent certain elements of things that are there because of the nature of a yid. Ki yetzel Adam ramanurav, it's natural. A person has a yetzahara, etc. Dam ziva, on the other hand, is when the person is in a certain extent getting his yetzahara even stronger, enticing his yetzahara even more than what the yetzahara would be trying to disturb and distract the person on his own. To use the expression of the chinuch, that ziva happens as a result when a person is going away from the normal straight path, when he's eating much more than usual, etc. In other words, here we're speaking about a person that's not just having the regular natural things, but he's going out of his way. And therefore you may think that in this case, this person, this Kli Cheres, maybe does become Tomei Me'achoyrav, even from these things, because he's ending up with such ra, with such evil things that are not there, necessary because of the nature of the person. For this, the Torah's Kohanim comes along and Rashi says that that's not the case. That when the Negiyas HaZov, only if the Negiyas HaZov, of the touching of the Zov was in a way that he moved the whole thing, which again in Avodas Hashem would mean that the whole general person was impacted, then the tumah could actually be even then the Kli Cheres would become tamei, in other words, even from these other things from the outside, because the whole person was moved by it. But usually Negiya, the touching, the contact with Olam Hazeh, even of the Zav, in other words, even if you went more than usual, could never really impact the essence of a Yid, as the Rambam paskins, that even a Yid that we need a force to do a mitzvah. So this forcing is only because of his chitzoni. His Yetzirah got the better of him. But even then, B'Pnimius, he wants to do everything what a Yid needs to do, and he wants to be like every Yid and wants to do all of the mitzvahs. And by forcing him, we take off that dust that was covering and concealing on his true desire of the Yid. It becomes Nizgala, the emes of Hashem, even until the Olam, even in this world, that the Yid says, Roitzani, I want to be like every single Yid, and to do all of the mitzvahs properly.